Welcome to Books on Air, the podcast that tells the story behind the book. It includes insights from authors about how they compose their work, what inspires them, and what they hope you'll take away from their book. Here's your host for this episode of Books on Air, Suzanne Harris.
Welcome to the Books on Air podcast. I'm Sloan Fremont, filling in for Suzanne Harris. This is a podcast where listeners get the secret story behind every book. Joining me today is Palibor Iversune, author of the book DaVinci's Mental Code. This book provides a detailed analysis of never-before-discussed embedded cues in one of Leonardo da Vinci's iconic artistic creations. It discusses why the Hermetic caduceus, adorned with its snakes and wings, became an establishment symbol for modern-day medical standards and practice, and helps the reader re-examine previously established theories backed by historical facts and observable evidence. So, Palibor, I want to welcome you to the Books on Air podcast.
Well, thank you, Sloan. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, so let's start out by telling the audience just a little bit about yourself and what led you to write your book, DaVinci's Mental Code.
Very well. I do, in fact, have a bipolar mind, and so did my mother, and it doesn't define me. And it tends to lead me to see things as per opposites, perhaps, where I'd have 10 to 14 day swings after my mother suddenly died. Maybe it triggered the gene in me to have 10 to 14 day high periods to low periods, where at the end of a 10 to 14 day high period, I would realize I was acting tyrannical. And in fact, it was me acting out the personality of my father, who now arguably I realize has a pathological personality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah. And so the lows were as bad as low as the highs were great. Narcissism, like if I left the room, I felt like people are missing out, like during the high period.
Mm-hmm.
And it was obviously irrational. It's self-serving, and I was having a lot of fun with it until I realized that other people's pain to my pleasure at the end of a cycle.
Yeah.
And this was all realized in hindsight after a lot of hours of psychoanalysts, dealing with psychiatrists. And life experience. I'm 48 now, sustained a couple suicide attempts, and that's okay. I don't want there to be, so did Tyson Fury. He's the heavyweight champion of the world. And Jim Carrey has a bipolar mind, and arguably so did Beethoven, and maybe Nikola Tesla. He was known to have migraines and the such. Anyway, I say that to give a bit of background on myself, to offer why I saw what I did in the DaVinci's Vitruvian Man.
Okay. Yes. And so the Vitruvian Man, that's the image of the man with his arms out and the circle around it. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. And I never knew about it. I never knew the name I didn't care about it until about 4 years ago.
Yeah. So in that image, you were able to see something different than maybe most people. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it was after meditation of family crises that his left eye is much more comparatively dark than his right eye. Mm-hmm. And that could be tied to, who knows why he did it. I just never heard anybody talk about it.
Yeah, I've never heard this discussed either. So when we were talking briefly beforehand about this, and actually Palibor showed me some images. So I encourage everybody in his book, he's got these images. I encourage you to go check out his book and see this.
They're not actually, the images are not in my book, but all you got to do is download it off the internet and zoom in on the face. And the left eye is unarguably darker than the right eye.
Right. And so when you were showing me that, and let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the conclusions you came to after looking at that, and maybe seeing it with the way your mind works.
Yeah, leading up to it was if I found myself acting excessively self-centeredly or selfishly, it could be as simple as being around my wife, an argument about how to load the dishwasher. Mm-hmm. If I had to have my way, eventually I would get a migraine. What I eventually realized was in my left hemisphere compared to my right hemisphere, when my heart was going out to say anybody suffering relatively more than myself. So I got at least the idea that both are not good. These are extremes.
Right.
And so there was major family crises in my family between around, that culminated in 2016.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And involved, this is my brother and my father, and we got through it. And then eventually my mother realized when she was 10 in her memoirs that she wrote for herself, which I stole. I got into her apartment. I took all her memoirs she wrote about before she passed on, about how when she was 10, she realized the masculine and feminine duality in her at age 10.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like obsessed by it because she had to when she had to fight her friend to get back her bike. Her friend stole her bike. This is when she had a great realization. Her friend stole her bike for a joyride, and she saw the friend driving by her front window when she was having dinner, and she realized she was going to have to confront her friend. And she said through this, she realized that more masculine than feminine in her. So what? She's age 10, and I never thought about this.
Yeah, very insightful for a 10-year-old.
This is the idea of duality,
right?
Where we all have, the idea that that's not a novel concept, right?
Right.
And so I was meditating in 2018, like literally, I don't know if prayer or meditation or just being stubborn and angry. Like, tell me, like I'm as bipolar as my mother. Tell me why. Like, if there's anything out there, anything that communicates down to us, tell me. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at the Vitruvian Man, and I didn't even know the name of it.
And that's the image that came to your mind.
I don't know. No, I don't know how it worked. Yeah, maybe, because I just recently watched the Da Vinci Code. I don't know.
Yeah.
But or maybe just because of studying various things, that image is always flashed, tends to be flashed a lot. I don't know. But I was drawn to it somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I called my friend, James Oliver, who studies a lot of this more than I do. Well, he's studied it longer. I've really done this crash course since the last 12 years. I was not a good student in high school. I've really done this crash course of trying to catch up with the world. I was a golf pro, and then by 2008, I realized I didn't know how the world worked because of the crash. And anyway, it was a big wake up call for me. There was a previous family crisis, and all of a sudden, I'm going crazy trying to. Maybe other people had awakenings around that time, but I was just studying everything I could get my hands on. And so, but my buddy James Oliver had been doing that much earlier, since maybe. Okay. He was like 15, and I started it when I was like 35. And so he knew the name. I go, what's that thing? So I did not know the name of the Vitruvian Man. He goes, the Vitruvian Man. And that's how, and then we started talking about it. And when I started looking at it, I go, the eyes, there's an equilateral triangle shading around the left eye and more of a circular shading around the right eye, stuff like this. And then I go, I wonder if his head's tilting right. Because if it is, he might be a man of conscience, Leonardo da Vinci, because the idea of these migraines I was having. And eventually I stumbled across Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who has a whole theory. He's written 2 books on it, Hemispheric Theory. In 2,000-page books. I have not read them. The first one 10 years ago, The Master and His Emissary. Okay. And he just recently wrote The Matter with Things. And so I start listening to him, and I go, he's got that falls in line with the Vitruvian Man.
And so you were in this meditation, the Vitruvian Man came to your mind, you started investigating, and then you started, as we were talking about, the dualities, these different things you start seeing in this that hasn't been discussed very much, as we talked about. There is the other man you mentioned who's talked briefly about it, but what did that do what conclusion did you come to after that? What was your realization, or how did that help you?
Yeah, the whole idea is to perhaps reduce stigma on anything at all, but in this case, bipolar. I think stigma is horrible. Right. And so maybe this is the idea that why should we be so stigmatic about maybe a natural law of the universe? Because every long-standing philosophical, theistic, whatever you want to call it, metaphysical philosophy of time, cross-culture, they talk about the same thing, whether it's ancient Chinese with the yin and the yang. Right. So ancient Chinese goes yin and yang. I'll just list off, I have it written down here, as I've written in my book, just so I don't forget it. In ancient Chinese, it's yin and yang. Ancient Abrahamic, it's good versus evil. Okay. Ancient Buddhism, they call it eternalism versus annihilationism.
Okay.
Yeah, in the end, everything falls to dust. Maybe if everybody's vying for the top of a hierarchy, you might have to sell out your best friend, or like, whatever it takes.
Yeah.
Only the strong survive, right? In the end, you might have to, Alexander the Great, murder everybody to prove that your culture is better, right?
Yeah.
So then ancient Native Americans call it dark and light, or light and dark.
Mm-hmm.
Ancient Hermeticists, ancient Greeks call it above and below.
Right.
And the New Agers call it positive and negative. I think, and I think we're all talking about the same thing. And maybe sacred geometry is equilateral triangle versus circle. That's very arguable because obviously, you can't have a less dynamic geometric shape where all the sides are equal length and straight edge than an equilateral triangle. And then if you add one more equal length straight edge side, it becomes a square. And that's 4, and then add one more equal. And as the sides get shorter, you keep adding equal length straight edge sides, and then eventually, once you get to 8, you get to an octagon and start circling out a bit.
Yeah.
And theoretically, if you keep doing it, theoretically, you keep doing it, and you get a circle.
Yeah.
So that's the idea of the most geometric dynamism might be a circle. As per sacred geometry, who knows? Like I see in the background, you got a hexagon hanging on the back of your wall. It's everywhere. So we didn't invent this, but to notice it, maybe perhaps sacred geometry says duality is equilateral triangle versus circle. Who knows? And in between is all the different
variations of it. Yeah. Very interesting. It's just very interesting topic and way to look at things, as you're talking about, with having a different mindset, a different approach, and a different view on this. It leads to more questions, which is what I like about what we're talking about today. It leads to a lot of unasked questions. It leads, like, as I'm sitting here thinking about this, and it leads to more questions. These are the kinds of conversation I call that are like expansive conversations, right? Because we're asking different questions and more questions in a different way, which leads to different ways of thinking, different ways of acting, and different ways of behaving.
100%. And I don't claim to know anything in absolute terms, and I struggle with that a lot. Meaning it's a lot easier just to claim you know everything, and it's a lot safer.
It's easier. Yeah, exactly.
And fair enough. Life's confusing enough.
Yeah, but then I think the other side of that is we know deep down we don't know everything, and when we start.
But if you admit that to somebody, then right, you don't want to be too vulnerable, right? Because people have, I guess, sorry to interrupt, hounding each other and so on. Yeah,
well, yeah, that's true. But I mean, for those who are the seekers, right, those that would listen to these types of conversations, those people that would be interested in your book, these types of people, as we are having this conversation, feeling like you know everything, or you're in a place where you're not growing, to me is very boring. I think I've heard that from my friends. I've heard that from people I've interviewed over the years. Being stuck and stagnant is boring. And often we need a different way to perceive something. We need a different way to look at something, because not only what we're talking about today with Da Vinci and his drawing, it's not just limited to that, right? Because if you're shifting your mind in that way, and you're asking different questions in different ways, that carries over to every other area of your life, right? Because then you'll start to approach,
which can be a bit daunting, which it's not for everybody.
Exactly, right. For those who are willing to do it, but
or compelled to do it.
Exactly, and it gets you a different
like uncontrollable or whatever. I mean,
right, and you start
being drawn to something, compelled. Sorry.
Yes, and you start to see things differently in problems or perceived problems that you had before. You start to look at them differently, and you find different solutions than you didn't have before.
Right, and that might be the idea of spiritual growth and testing. Right, in the Bible it says, or any other place, maybe in Buddhism as well, with knowledge comes sorrow and stuff like that.
Yeah,
meaning maybe it's not for everybody. If you're not compelled to do something, maybe there'd be you wouldn't be drawn to it. Where those 10 to 14 day periods of high. It's interesting you said, but you brought up the word boring, because by the end of it, like, I always thought, why would I flip? Because by the end of it, I ran out of creative juice within the idea that I knew everything, and I would end out hurting people for my own. I don't know if they call it a psychic draw off of people, but when I would feel by the end of it, if I hurt somebody, to win a moment, I never forget it.